Fine.
Yes, I am, and thank you for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stuart Streck. I am a hazardous materials investigator with the United States Department of Transportation, Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. For those who don't know, PHMSA is a small agency under the Department of Transportation, but we have a huge span as it comes to the uh, coordination and the authoring of the 49 Code of Federal Regulations as it pertains to the transportation of hazardous materials. I myself am a hazmat investigator out of the southern region. I cover the southeastern 8 states, including Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And today I have the distinct opportunity to speak with you in regards to hazardous materials transportation, regulatory affairs, and some of the things that I've seen out in the field. Next slide. PHMSA often produces guides, brochures, informational materials that help to navigate through the regulations of the 49 CFR. These are not a replacement for the 49 CFR. Quite often, with this brochure in particular, I do get some folks who tell me, hey, you have an incomplete listing of infectious substances in the brochures. Well, that is not a regulatory document. We use those as examples. So if you don't see your information in the brochure, you're probably not looking at the regulations as it should. Next slide. So our objectives today are to provide an overview of regulatory requirements for transportation of 6.2 materials, which includes package selection, marking and labeling, shipping papers and emergency response information, and transportation security plans and training. Next slide. So our two common areas that we have are Category A infectious substances and Category B infectious substances. Under Category A is where we also house select agents, as select agents are by nature a Category A infectious substance, however have occurred an additional classification by other regulatory bodies. And we recognize those again as Category A infectious substances. Next slide, please. Packaging requirements for the transportation of infectious substances can be found in several areas in the 49 CFR. 173.24 and 24A are the general packaging requirements for basically all hazardous materials. They include some items as the package can't leak in transportation. So it's an overall general requirement for packaged hazardous materials. When we delve deeper into Division 6.2 infectious substances, we run into 173.134, 173.196, and 173.197 and 199. These are for both Category A, regulated medical waste, and Category B. When we talk about package testing, especially when it comes to Category A infectious substances, we're directed to 178.609. This is where we have listed out a battery of tests that a good hazardous materials packaging for a Category A infectious substance has to undergo before it's approved to contain hazardous materials specifically for infectious substance transportation. Next slide. Other pertinent references that we will be talking about today. 172.203 as it pertains to shipping papers and more specifically the technical name. That tends to be a hot button topic when it comes to 6.2 infectious substances. Package marking, including the technical name. Hazardous materials training is the #1 violation that we find out in the field. Transportation security plan and aircraft transportation. Next slide. So Category A infectious substance packaging is best described as a triple packaging system. We call it a system because it's consisting of several components that are required to create one good handling package. So we have the specimen that goes into the inner receptacle. The inner receptacle is then placed into the secondary receptacle, which is for liquids. It either has a absorbent material that can absorb the entire contents of the package, or it would be considered sift proof. For liquids, we're looking at a requirement of either the primary receptacle or the secondary receptacle of having a 95 kPa rating, which means that when it's placed on an aircraft, it can withstand the pressure differentials when the aircraft gains or descends in altitude. Towards the center of the photograph, you'll see an example of a UN package certification mark. I'll talk about this in a little bit, but the UN package certification mark is one of the main differences between a Category A and Category B infectious substance packaging. Both are triple packaging systems. However, Category A packagings are the ones that do require the actual physical testing and certification to contain a Category A infectious substance. Next slide, please. This UN mark, I like to call this the license plate for the package for the capability of holding a hazardous material. So this is a UN standard. Back in the day, DOT used to prescribe the type of package that actually went in and how that package was actually constructed. Under the UN model, it went more towards a performance-based test. So instead of DOT telling you how to make your box, we side with the UN and we say what your box has to sustain to be able to successfully contain hazardous materials. So we have our United Nations number and we have our box identifier. So this tells me that it's a fiberboard box and it's has a 4GU, a class 6.2. On normal hazardous materials packages, this would be where you would see the capabilities for kilograms and hydrostatic tests and the like. Well, specifically for Category A infectious substances, we put class 6.2. So there is no question that this package was tested for 6.2 materials. The year of manufacture, the country, and also the test facility or the manufacturer's code, we're able to take a look at this package and actually backtrack it to when it was actually tested and be able to observe the test report on how the package performed in testing. This becomes particularly of interest when we see packages failing in transportation. It's fairly difficult for people to actually counterfeit some of these packages just based on the fact that they would have to nail the test facility code and the test report number right on the money. So we're able to backtrack that and verify. Next slide, please. So the testing of packages. 6.2 packages actually go through a very rigorous battery of tests. Normal hazardous materials packagings do not go through these tests. I like to call this the Samsonite gorilla test. So I guess maybe I'm showing my age for those of you who remember the old Samsonite commercials with where they throw their suitcase in with a gorilla. But these tests are no less difficult. So we want to make sure that in all weather conditions, so we wet the package, but also we want to account for any type of dry ice that may be included into the package. So we want to make sure that it's not going to disintegrate when it gets wet, and it's not going to embrittle when it gets frozen. And we also want to make sure that if it is mishandled in any way, that it is going to be able to withstand the rigors of transportation. Now, I do have the variation U. So the variation U is a variation that allows uh, inner packagings to be changed. You know, for smaller packagings, less number of inner packagings, or even fragile packagings. And the fragile packagings is typically how it's tested. So it's tested with the innermost fragile package. If you have a 4GU, there are some variations that you can do for the packaging. Otherwise, how the packaging instructions are written is how you have to bring that package into compliance. There's no swapping inner containers. You have to put it as the manufacturer intended. Next slide, please. So, marking and labeling. This is probably one of the most important when it comes to the outer package. This is what the layperson, the transportation string sees more so than the shipping documentation. This is what a first responder is going to be responding to when somebody says that there is a package on the side of the road. This is their indication that there's a hazardous material and what type of hazardous material is actually on the inside. Now, proper shipping name and the UNID number, what that allows is that allows for first responders to actually give a positive indication of the type of hazardous materials that's on the inside. Now, for international transportation, the real main focus is going to be on that UN number. Responders are going to rely on information typically provided in the emergency response guide or the orange book that is also authored by the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. There is a requirement that everything in hazardous materials transportation has to be in English. However, there is no requirement that first responders in other countries speak English. So the emergency response guide is printed in several different languages, and by using the UNID number, they're able to look it up by the number and in their native tongue determine what type of hazardous materials are inside. We also need the shipper and consignee identification. We need to know who this is coming from or who this is going to. So first responders can make contact and say, okay, just what am I dealing with? The infectious substance label for category A is different than what is required for category B. Category B just requires a square on point with UN 3373 and the proper shipping name. Whereas for category A, this label that you see here is required to be placed on the outermost packaging of the hazardous material. Orientation arrows are required only as applicable. Orientation arrows are required when you have a hazardous material, a liquid hazardous material in combination package, or you have a vented closure. And that's typically for drums or items that are meant to off gas. Well, I certainly hope that your infectious substances are not going to off gas in transportation. So, orientation arrows as applied today would be for liquids in combination packaging. Mainly for the sheer fact that if you have a bottle inside the box, we will not be able to tell from the outside which way the closure is oriented to ensure that the package will not leak. Next slide, please. So the technical name. The technical name being marked on the outside of the package should not be marked. So in 172.301B states in part a technical name should not be marked on the outer package of a Division 6.2 material. So specifically, we want to call it a Category A infectious substance, or as it pertains to either 2814 or 2900, the proper shipping name, and leave it at that. We don't need to place the technical name on the outside of the actual package. Next slide, please. Now, shipping papers, it's a little different. we have some basic information that is required in a specific format for hazardous materials identification and response purposes. And I have those in that specific order listed on the screen. So our UN identification number comes first and foremost. That is what you're going to lead your description off with. It used to be in the United States that it was actually further down in the list. It was actually in the middle. But for international purposes, we aligned with the UN requirements and we put the UN number first because we did realize that first responders don't speak English in all places. But however, numbers tend to be a universal language. So we put that universal language first for first responders. The proper shipping name followed by the technical name. Now, when it comes to a technical name, and I'll get into this a little bit further in the next couple slides, we're really looking for two things: the generic microbiological group, or, in quotes, suspected category A infectious substance. We tend to lean more towards the generic side versus being more specific on what's actually in the package. As most of you know who are actually in the programs for CDC and CBP and USDA, there's other documentation that gets more specific. So for transportation purposes of passing hands between carriers and the lay person, we tend to leave a little bit more mystery involved. Hazard class and division, and then there is no packing group for a category A infectious substance. Packing group is more along the lines of how dangerous is dangerous. We have packing groups 1, 2, and 3. For category A infectious substance, we decided not to categorize it as a packing group 1, 2, or 3 because it's a danger in a very unique category. So we leave that out. The number and type of package and the weight in pounds or kilograms. So we need to know the number. How many boxes are you shipping? And the type of package. So if you're shipping it in a box, say, 2 boxes, 1 box. Be very generic in your description, but use common language. This is more for the first responders. When they have your shipping papers and they want to tally up the hazardous materials, you put 4 boxes, they're going to try and look for 4 boxes. If you put a 4 GUs, they're not going to know what you're talking about. So we need to keep it fairly simple in common terms as to what type of package it is. The shipper certification. The shipper certification is very important. This is a statement that you are making that is mandated in the Code of Federal Regulations that you have properly classified, described, packaged, shipping papers, marked, labeled. You have done your due diligence to protect not only yourselves, but everybody else that's affected by the transportation stream in the United States and throughout the world. So you're signing a document stating that you did your due diligence. So this is a very important statement. This should cause everybody pause and think, did I do everything that I needed to do to ensure this is going to go from point A to point B without harming anybody else in between? And then lastly, the emergency response telephone number. When things happen, we need to have somebody to call. So this is a 24-hour while it's in transportation telephone number. It has to go to somebody who is willing, capable of handling the hazardous materials questions that come in, because more than likely the folks who are going to be calling that number are first responders and they need to get a hold of somebody right now. Next slide, please. So a technical name. I told you that there's always a lot of questions in these forums when it comes to a technical name. So I've actually, in the next couple slides, put where we describe what that technical name actually entails. So for a category A infectious substance in 172.203 of the 49 CFR is the exact excerpt as to what we expect for a category A infectious substance. The technical name is defined in 49 CFR 171.8. And this is more than just a definition. This actually gives us a little bit more direction as to what a technical name should be and how it should be applied for 6.2 infectious substances. Next slide, please. And 171.8 states in part, generic descriptions are authorized for use as technical names provided they readily identify the general chemical group or microbiological group. For proficiency testing only, generic microbiological descriptions such as bacteria, mycobacteria, fungus, and viral samples may be used. So again, we're keeping this fairly general when it comes to the technical name of the hazardous materials when it pertains to 6.2s. Next slide, please. The Transportation Security Plan. So in DOT, we don't try to recreate the wheel. There are several instances where we actually defer to other agencies. And if you are shipping a category A infectious substance and you are involved in the DSAT program for the select agents and toxins, you will already have a security plan based on their protocols. We also have requirements for security plans as well. And we take a look at your security plans and we make sure that our general areas are actually listed in that security plan. So the security plan must include the assessment of the site and transportation security risks. This is really important. In my previous job, when Homeland Security was just formed, and it was decided that transportation security needed to be looked at, and something needed to be done. I was one of the guinea pigs that was involved in the Marine Transportation Security Act, which how do I want to put this? We were one of the first ones out there, and then everybody kind of followed suit. And one of the things that came out of this was we could not use cookie cutter security plans. We needed to make sure that the security plan addressed the specifics of the facility and the uniqueness of the company for the safe transportation of hazardous materials. So there are companies out there that provide cookie cutter plans. However, the intent is for you to include your site specific information. So if you do not have a site assessment for your security plan, if you did not build your security plan off of assessment of your security risks, then that's something that's going to need to be bolstered. It needs to address personnel security, unauthorized access, and en-route security. So we need to make sure that all of the pertinent infrastructure, the correct people are in the correct positions, and then when it's going from point A to point B, that there are security protocols that are put into place and adhered to for the safe transportation of hazardous materials. We need to ensure that job titles, duties, training plan, and testing are included in this. When we say job titles, we don't want to say John Doe or Jane Doe. People move, people retire. We need to ensure that the position listed, not the person. So if it's the manager or if it's the RSO or whoever is in charge, they need to make sure It's listed by the job title and not the person's name, what their duties are, and of course, a training plan and testing. And we'll talk about training and testing a little bit more in depth here in a minute. It needs to be reviewed annually and revised as required. Next slide.
And we do have 5 minutes left in the presentation, and we
Okay.
have a few questions in the QA as well.
Not a problem. So emergency response information needs to be placed, the telephone number needs to be placed on the shipping paper, and it needs to stand out. As I said before, this is going to be utilized by somebody who needs information now. Next slide. Training requirements. There are 5 general training requirements. So general awareness and familiarization of hazardous materials regulations, safety training, function-specific training, and security awareness and in-depth security training as it pertains to the Transportation Security Plan. Now for Category B is a little different when it comes to training. And if you have any questions about Category B, feel free to give me a call offline and we can discuss a little bit further. Next slide. Training needs to be conducted within 90 days of employment or a job function change. On the 91st day, if that person is doing that function and they haven't been trained, and it doesn't matter if you're standing right next to them, you are not in compliance. Recurrent training needs to be done every 3 years based on the initial training. Next slide. So training plus testing equals DOT hazmat training. So we need to make sure that the training's done and that there's testing that is done. And that encompasses DOT training. Next slide. We have a Hazardous Materials Information Center. They run 9 to 5 Eastern Time. Some highly dedicated individuals that are willing to answer your call. If for some reason you call in the off hours, you can leave a message or you can send them an email, and they are fairly quick to respond. Next slide. This is my information. If you have any questions, please take a screenshot and feel free to send me an email. That is the best way to get a hold of me. And at that time, I give back my time.
And Adam, I do see we have some questions. If you can queue up the questions.
Sure, Mary. I will start with the first one here. And I think that Mr. Streck actually answered this one in the next slide when it came in. What do you consider generic microbiological name? Are you referring to the genus of the organism or just stating bacteria, virus, etc.?
We're just keeping it as general as possible.
Okay.
So that is actually what I cited was actually directly out of the book. So
okay. Hopefully that answers Ms. Maloney's question. The second one, are the models or drafts of the Transportation Security Plan available to be used for consultation?
We don't have any model drafts. To be quite honest with you, our regulations for security plans are about 2.5 pages long, and they're fairly easy to navigate. So we don't have any examples or any forms that are out there. So we pretty well rely on the individual for what they come up with.
Thank you, sir. And George, someone is asking to have that Mr. Streck's contact slide be put back up for a minute. And while Mr. Amerson's bringing it back up, one other question was from Ms. Donnelly. Does training have to be done in person, or can you use an online training program that is not live?
Training does not have to be done in person. That is a fairly common question. However, coming from the training realm, I highly encourage it for somebody's first time, because if you have questions, it's hard to ask a computer screen to explain. It's encouraged to do it in person. However, you can use other means as well. But again, training is the training portion, but also the testing portion to ensure that a level of competency has been obtained.
And thank you. I appreciate that, Streck. And I believe that is the last of the questions, Mary. So I think we are ready to move on, and hopefully everybody was able to grab the screenshots there. And I think we're good to go.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Our next speaker, we have two speakers, both of our biologic threat exclusion coordinators. We have Mr. George Amerson, who covers the Houston area, and Mr. Sean Smith,